speaking of color and size, now I'm a backyard gardener, so we do tomatoes, and of course there's always small green tomatoes and then the bigger red tomatoes. With the apples on a tree, if you're testing an apple from a tree, do you assume that the whole tree is at the same place because of that king bloom time range situation?
You make that assumption, and it's fair to do that, but there are differences. Fruit that's grown lower to the ground may be different from fruit that's high in the tree that has there's more sun, so things are happening faster in that apple. It's degrading more. It's being damaged more because it's higher in the tree and getting perhaps sunburn, and so maturity is increasing. Apples growing down low in the tree, it's under the canopy of the tree. There's more shade, and so it's going to be a little slower in its development. A little less color, for example. It may not be converting the starch to sugar like the rest of the apples on the outside perimeter of the tree. That would be perhaps a little bit different than what the interior apples are in that tree. So you will find differences like that in the tree, but oftentimes we hope that they're minute enough that we can still manage the tree accordingly. So.
When you start to pick a tree, do you pick the outer upper first and then go back, or do you just pick a whole tree?
You know, in the old days, we just picked the whole tree, but in recent years, a trend has developed where the grade standards, because of the amount of apples in the industry being a surplus, the grade standards have become tighter and tighter, and so it's not as efficient to take apples from, pick the apples, ship it to a warehouse, put it in storage, only to have that apple be a cull and not marketable.
Right.
And so growers have been almost forced into the position of having to be more selective when they pick. And so we actually have a circumstance occurring where we'll do multiple picks. And so we'll have a crew go through, we'll pick a certain percentage of the tree. Here's the most red colored apples, for example. And so they'll pick that off, and then we'll wait a few more days or pick somewhere else in the orchard, and we'll come back and we'll test that block again, of those trees again, and say, okay, we have enough color, let's pick again. And sometimes we'll do that 3, maybe even 4 times. And so it just depends on different factors for that different variety and that season, but multiple pick has become an interesting trend for the future. Not as profitable in some ways because you're having to come back to the same tree and pick it 3 or 4 times. But so you want to avoid that and grow good quality fruit from the beginning.
Interesting. Yeah. It is a science, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Last year we had some questions come from people about the appearance of the apple inside. Some folks that came by that were avid dehydrators made some comment about, oh, something must have happened during the growing season because there's this ring, and you explained to us something about water coring.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit now?
Water coring is a maturity issue with the apples, and in particular with a Fuji, and I have a Fuji here. A Fuji is acceptable to have water core. In fact, it's one of the things we like to see to a point. Just because it brings on more flavor to the apple. So when a person eats it, it's a great eating experience because it's juicy and it's sweet. So water core is when an apple actually converts the starch in the center of the apple to sugar. And there's a phase that it's going through in maturity. And so if you don't mind, let's just cut an apple here. I've got a knife and a couple apples with us today. Not saying that these may or may not have water core, but you can see, as you look at this apple here, you can see that there are just the very beginning indications here in this vascular bundle area of water core starting to develop, and it will start at these points and at the interior of the apple and grow out to this point, and it will actually become a clear flesh. And that's basically water, and that's why it's called water core, because it's also starting in the center of the apple. So basically what's happening is the starch in the center of the apple now is starting to convert to sugar, and that's called water core. Now, like I say, As far as long-term storage, it's not as desirable because it is a maturing process and the apple is breaking down. But on the other hand, it's a very sweet thing because now instead of having a tart or bitter apple, you have an apple that is very sweet and gives you a good eating experience. And we've had apples, of course, just out in somebody's garage sitting in a box last for 4, 5, 6 months with water core in it. So water core is not a bad thing in Fuji's. It gives it a good eating experience. And so when a person who wants to dehydrate and slice these up and make dehydrated apple slices, that's something that they'll watch and they'll notice for that and say, oh, okay, that's good. Now I know what it is. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
And what about, Shauna told us about farmer's pick.
Right. And
what does that mean?
Yeah, and all that really means is that when a grower walks out into his orchard and he picks an apple off the tree, as we mentioned before as one of the examples of the measurements or tools we use, okay, is it ready to pick? When he walks out into the orchard and picks an apple and he eats it, is that a good eating experience? And so if you find that the apple is tart and or if it's on the other extreme, soft and mealy, you know you've gone too far, especially if it's still hanging on the tree. And so what we're trying to do is be a good taste tester in the field. So we'll go out as a grower and sample that apple and say, okay, is this a good apple? Does it taste great when I eat it? Is it a good, pleasurable eating experience? And if that's the case, then that apple is ready to pick. Now that's a little bit of a different scenario when we talk in terms of marketability. That's not always the way that we can pick the apples in the field.
Okay. How are apples best preserved for eating fresh? I mean, do we have to keep them in the refrigerator? Should we put them in the refrigerator after we get them home? Or do something else?
Yeah, that's another great question. Let's look at it from the best scenario to the other side of the range is what will be manageable for most people. The best scenario would be is if you were to buy a box of apples, bring it home and go through and wash the apples, dry them, and then put them in several plastic bags and store them in the crisper or in the bottom of your refrigerator. I talked to a lady one time who did that very thing, and we were visiting her. She bought the box of apples in November one year. We were visiting her in July the following year, and she said, "Hey, you want an apple?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So she brought out one of our apples and said, "Here." We tasted it, and it was just as though it was picked the day before. It was that good. And here it had been picked in November, and we were eating it in July the following year. So, and that's the way it was stored. She did it the right way. So that would be a great scenario. It's a consistent temperature. It's your refrigerator temperature, so you're in the high 30s, maybe as far as the temperature range. They're already washed, but dry, so the moisture doesn't create a mold or mildew problem inside the bag. And you've got the plastic there that helps keep the moisture in the apple and in that environment so they don't dehydrate. Moving away from that, is somebody going to be able to put a 40-pound box of apples in their refrigerator? Most people don't have that kind of room or space. So the next best scenario would be perhaps if you've got some room out in your garage or if you've got in your basement, put the box of apples on the concrete surface, either out in the garage in a cold or a cool, dark place, or down in the basement, same conditions, and leave the lid on. Maybe the first day or two you could pull the lid because there's moisture there because they've been in cold storage in that semi-in-transit or straight from the warehouse where they're stored in a cold storage environment. And so there may be a little condensation that develops. You might pull the lid and let that condensation evaporate a little bit and then put the lid back on. I have seen the difference between the lid on the box and the lid off the box in terms of storing apples. I've seen that it makes a tremendous difference in terms of whether or not that apple dehydrates. They look a little softer, meatier skin to it. You can actually see that. And Goldens are more so that way. They'll lose their moisture more readily. So if the lid is on the box, it tends to keep the moisture in there, and they last a long time. If you pull the lid off and you leave it for 3 months, that moisture is going to tend to just escape completely, and the apple will tend to dehydrate, and you'll see that a little bit of shrinkage in the skin. So from one extreme to the other in terms of what's available to a person in their household conditions, that would be probably the best way to do it. So.
Okay, and of course, some people don't realize apples are pretty much picked within a 4-week period of time.
Right.
And then they are kept in cold storage. So the apples that are picked, like this lady that you talked about, in November are the same apples that we're eating in July.
That's right.
Of the next year. So quality-wise, when they're stored in a controlled situation and then shipped to the stores, they're maintained in pretty much the same condition as when they were picked, with a little bit of depreciation, if you will.
Right, there's some variability. We can talk about that if we have time here also, but you're right. There are different conditions and factors that come into play there, and most people don't understand that whole scenario, because it's a whole there's a whole marketing side to this, and a management of handling a large volume of apples that is supplied to the world. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, apples that are picked, apples that you buy in the grocery store in July were picked back in the fall, depending upon the variety, because some have, like we mentioned earlier, those growing those dates after full bloom, when apples mature properly. Those apples are all picked during that fall window, September, October, maybe November. And so if you, in some of the early varieties like Gala, it would come on even in August, depending upon the growing region. And so but you still have that relatively short picking window, and whatever's picked there is stored, and that's what's sold throughout the entire year into the marketplace. The exception to that would be in import sales, where we have countries around the world who are exporting their apples into the United States, for example. And you might buy an apple from Chile or New Zealand, and that's an apple that may have a different picking cycle, and that would be a different scenario. But what we pick here domestically, it's all picked during that one window, and it's stored, and then that's what we eat 365 days a year.